Okay, I think we should begin. Hello and good evening from York. My name is Tim Ayres, and on behalf of Elizabeth Tyler and myself as co-directors of the Centre for Medieval Studies, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the first York Medieval Lecture of this academic year. We're really delighted to be joined by Dr. Stephennie Mulder to present on a topic that speaks so directly to our wide range of research and teaching in the Islamic world and the Viking world, and one that reflects our commitment to contributing to the current state of medieval studies. And I'd like now to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Richard McClary, to introduce our speaker. Richard.
Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephennie Mulder. As many of you will know, she's an associate professor at the University of Texas in Austin. She was the head ceramicist at Balis in Syria, so she knows how to get to grips with material down and dirty. Done extensive fieldwork across the Middle East. But she's not just a medievalist, I know some of us are, but she also works with contemporary art of resistance in Syria. Multiple award-winning book author. Her book, The Shrines of the Alids in Medieval Syria, is a spectacular piece of work. And she's also written numerous articles in leading journals in our field. And she's also the president of Middle East Medievalists, which is very fitting for this setting. But that's more than enough from me. She really needs no introduction. So I'll hand over. Stephennie, welcome to York.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's a complete honor to be here and to be asked to deliver the York Medieval Lecture. Thank you so much, Tim and Elizabeth and Jillian, for organizing this event. And hello to everyone, wherever you are, all over the world. One of the wonderful peculiarities or wonderful things about our current very stressful and anxiety-ridden moment in many ways is that we can actually come together in these types of formats. Of course, I would have been in York at this time had it not been for the pandemic. So I'm a little sorry that I'm still here in Texas. Not that I'm not sorry to be in Texas, because we're working hard on transforming Texas here too, especially in our current moment. But I would love to have been there in York with all of you. But the upside is that many more people can attend events like this, and so I'm very much looking forward to the conversation after I present my talk. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen. I believe everyone is aware that if you have, I think we're holding questions till the end, but if people have questions, they're welcome to type them into the Q&A. And we've got such a large audience that I'm not sure we'll get to all of them, but we'll certainly try to answer a number of them after I present my paper. Okay. It seemed like something from an episode of the History Channel's popular hit show, Vikings. 3 years ago, in October of 2017, a textile fragment found in a 10th century Viking boat grave in Sweden was said to bear the words Allah and Ali. The textile, which had been published in 1938 following archaeological excavation, was rediscovered by Swedish textile archaeologist Dr. Annika Larsson as she worked on an exhibition on the finds from the Viking age towns of Birka and Gamla Uppsala last fall. In fall of 2017. Patterns on the textiles, Larsson said, reminded her of the styles of Arabic script found in mausolea and tombs from Central Asia, as well as on medieval Spanish ribbons, as she put it. Based on her findings, Uppsala University, Sweden's most venerable institution of higher learning, issued a press release, including this image of the textile and Larsson's reconstruction drawing, as well as quotes from Larsson saying that it was a staggering discovery. Within days, dozens of newspapers, from the BBC to the New York Times to the Guardian, had reported the story, calling it a breakthrough, and it had gone viral on the internet. Some reports were more measured than others, but the hype extended to headlines asking, were Vikings Muslim? The reality is, the Viking textile from Birka has no Arabic on it at all, let alone the words Allah or Ali. To be clear, evidence for contact between the Vikings and the Islamic world is without question abundant and uncontested, but this particular textile fragment cannot be counted among that evidence. When this became clear to me a week or so after news of the finding of the textile was released, I thought of writing an opinion piece. But given how rapidly the news story was spreading, on something of a whim, I decided instead to lay out the evidence for my claim in a 60-tweet long Twitter thread. And yes, you heard that right, 60 tweets, which is frankly ridiculous by Twitter standards. In the thread, I made an art historically based argument that refuted Larsson's claims about the textile. Almost before I had finished typing in the second tweet, it began to be shared 10, then 20 retweets at a time, and within 30 minutes, it too had gone viral. Now, trust me, no one was more surprised about this than I was. When I started my thread, I had fewer than 500 followers on Twitter, which is basically like saying I'm a grain of sand on a beach. But within hours, the thread had been shared hundreds and then thousands of times. And by that afternoon, I was on the phone with National Geographic, The Atlantic, the trendy arts journal Hyperallergic, and major media. Eventually, news outlets like The Guardian changed their headline and their story. The Independent wrote an entirely new story based largely on my thread, and numerous others added updates or altered their original story. Uppsala University, for their part, tried to walk a somewhat strained line between supporting the researcher and disavowing her claims, downplaying and changing the sensationalistic language of the original press release at least 3 times over the course of that week, and finally adding a sort of disclaimer page. Look, on the face of it, this story is pretty bizarre. Why would a story about an obscure 10th century archaeological textile elicit a media firestorm? Why would the public be so interested in a 3-inch long fragment of textile from a long forgotten excavation? What role did the medium itself, Twitter, have with its heavy reliance on images as transmitters of knowledge and ideas play in this process? What the rapid rise and equally rapid fall of this story reveals is perhaps more telling about this particular moment in our hyperspeed media world than it is about my brilliant Twitter skills or about actual Vikings or Muslims. That the unpeer-reviewed claims of a single scholar, false from beginning to end, could rise to international media prominence in the matter of a few short days should be cause for thoughtful reflection by academics, journalists, and the public alike. And in the era of fake news, at least in the US, unsubstantiated understandings of the past have become a national security issue that threatens to topple our democracy. As we all know, as we speak, the votes are still being counted in the aftermath of a tumultuous election shaped by ideas about race and identity that have shaken the very core of our democratic institutions. And as events during the Trump years have shown, the use of the medieval past has a very contemporary role to play in constructing white nationalist identities. How can scholars of the medieval world most profitably confront the contemporary appropriation of our field in the service of white nationalist and white identitarian agendas? Today, I'd like to look at this question through the lens of an art historian and ask specifically how images and objects construct the medieval past and how the methods and practices of material and image-based fields might profitably be used in the service of our current effort at decolonizing the field of medieval studies. This image-based approach is particularly important because not only was an image at the center of the Viking Allah story, but images have played a pivotal role in the way we have constructed our understanding of the medieval and early modern past. Indeed, through the field of art history and its traditional narratives, images and works of art played a key role in the construction of our idea of what the medieval past was, by framing medieval art as the irrational, subaltern other to be superseded by the later Renaissance. In the early 20th century, in the aftermath of World War I, and as Europe underwent the fractured post-war politics that would lead to the Second Great World War, the German art historian Aby Warburg coined the term Bilderfahrzeuge, or image vehicles, to express the way images circulate, enchant, and act on us as a direct, powerful, agentive force of communication. For Warburg, images communicated directly and intuitively, irrespective of their relationship to or lack of relationship to textual sources about the past. To make this point, Warburg created the Mnemosyne Atlas, a series of panels containing thematically related images, to show how images communicate directly with each other and with us as active agents in the world. Today, it seems that if Warburg's aim was to establish the primacy of the image, that goal has certainly reached its apotheosis with the rise of digital media. In an age in which we individually consume hundreds, if not thousands, of images in a single day. It might be fair to say that in some way, the internet itself is one great Mnemosyne Atlas, and Google Images a screen upon which thematic clusters of images are arranged side by side in horizontal rows, sorted not by the eccentric mind of an early 20th century art historian, but by the perhaps equally mysterious, seemingly impersonal algorithms of Google. In this image-rich environment, the work of art historians, cultural historians, and media scholars has never been more urgent, as politicians and university administrators work to deconstruct and defund the arts, humanities, and traditional paper libraries, thereby restricting our access to and our ability to reconstruct the complex, multiracial, and multi-confessional medieval past. How can we, as scholars of medieval studies, journalists, or even members of the public, respond to this world of social media image construction and circulation? This evening, or afternoon here in Texas, I'd like to look more closely at the Viking Allah story for some answers to these questions. And I'd like to propose that we are once again living in a moment of fracture, trauma, and deep skepticism about the humanist project, one that is very like the one that generated Warburg's intellectual intervention. Unlike many of his contemporaries who conceived of history as progressive, Warburg, in which the backwardness of the medieval period was redeemed eventually by the Renaissance, envisioned as a moment of profound cultural unity, Warburg interpreted the period of the Middle Ages as well as the subsequent era of the Renaissance as a period of transition and uncertainty, viewing these periods as abstracted from the course of time. Warburg proposed a distinctive concept of time. For him, time was not linear, developmental, and historicist, but circuitous, cyclical, and repetitive. Warburg argued that history returns again and again to a series of themes that continually resurface and reanimate, a phenomenon he dubbed Nachleben, the survival or persistence of images and ideas. It is this survival, I will argue, that animates the Viking Allah story, and in which we can find one possible response. So let me walk you through the thread I wrote, after which I will return to the questions raised here. As an Islamic art historian and archaeologist, when I encountered the story of the Viking Allah, I was immediately suspicious about the style of Arabic epigraphy in Larsson's reconstruction drawing, pictured here on the right. It's very important to note that at the outset, it was a reconstruction drawing, an image of the original artifact upon which Larsson had based her claim, a fact that would have been immediately apparent to any archaeologist. The primary issue was a serious problem of dating. The Birka Viking textile dates to the 10th century, while the style of epigraphy in Larsson's reconstruction drawing dates to the 15th century, 500 years later. It's a style called square Kufic, which is distinguished from other earlier styles of Kufic by being constrained by a set geometric grid, usually a square, hence the name square Kufic. Kufic is an angular script and is one of the earliest forms of Arabic writing, and it's common in various forms from at least the 10th century. But square Kufic is a distinctive development, and the very earliest examples of square Kufic, two examples of which you see here, date to the 11th century. But the style of square Kufic represented in Larsson's drawing is a later form, which evolved in Iran and Central Asia in the Timurid period, between 1370 and 1526, and which became widespread in the Safavid era, 1501 to 1736. This example, taken from Safavid Isfahan, contains the words, "O Allah," at the center, and the name Ali on the right. It uses, in other words, it uses the same words Larsson believed she saw, and it is a good comparison for the claims made about the Birka textile. The key difference between earlier examples and the square Kufic in Larsson's reconstruction drawing is that the final character in the drawing has an Arabic letter Ha with a hook over it that indicates it belongs firmly to the post-15th century style of square Kufic. That style of Ha, to put it simply, just doesn't exist prior to the Timurid period. This matters because Larsson had specifically cited Central Asian funerary architecture as comparanda for her textile fragment, but unfortunately, the dates don't add up. The textile is from the 10th century, whereas this style of square Kufic doesn't appear until the 15th century. But for the sake of argument, let's assume there were 10th century textiles with square Kufic on them, perhaps as yet undiscovered or unpublished. Perhaps Larsson's find is the first example of the form that would become widespread 500 years later. It turns out that that theory is also problematic, and for an even more fundamental reason. The drawing doesn't actually say Allah at all. Instead, Larsson's drawing says Lillah, a nonsensical word in Arabic. The first letter, in other words, is not an aleph, which is the first letter in Arabic, but a lam, as Arabic linguist Marian van Putten has confirmed. Although the Arabic letters aleph and lam resemble each other, aleph never connects to the letters following it as lam does. Arabic phrases like alhamdulillah incorporate the phrase lillah, which in that context means praise to God. However, the phrase to God doesn't typically stand alone, and it's always spelled lillah with 2 uprights, not 3. In short, to argue that lillah and Allah are the same would be as absurd as arguing that Dodd and God are the same word. This line of faulty Arabic epigraphic reasoning is similar to a claim made for another sensational find, the Viking ring said to say Lillah, to or for God, which was widely publicized in 2015. For the ring, as Leiden epigrapher Marian van Putten has shown, the best conclusion is that it represents a kind of pseudo-Kufic, false Kufic, a form of Kufic that was meant to imitate the look of real Arabic, but which is in fact only meaningless geometric forms. But still, the presence of pseudo-Kufic on this Viking ring tells us something important, that Arabic was valued by the Vikings as a mark of social status or capital. In this context, a ring or another object bearing Arabic script is, if we consider it not as writing, but as an image, a perfect example of Warburg's notion of Bilderfahrzeuge, an image vehicle. In other words, an object bearing an image that travels across time and cultures. And in fact, Warburg's first studies on tapestries demonstrated how textiles, as highly mobile objects intended to be portable, are particularly powerful Bilderfahrzeuge. In the case of images of Arabic writing in Viking contexts, instead of the transfer of images of antiquity through time, we have the case of the contemporary transfer of an image of a faraway place to Viking times and Viking lands. For Warburg, steeped as he was in the Western art historical tradition before the dominance of modernism, images primarily meant figures or objects. But images, of course, need not be figural to be powerful carriers of ideas, associations, and memory. Art historian Griselda Pollock has argued that, quote, image is neither depiction nor iconography. It might be better understood as configuration. For instance, abstract art produces an effect that, even if it remains at the very edge of figurality, the viewer experiences as an image, not of anything specific, but with a kind of structure through which it can be remembered, end quote. For the Vikings, untutored in Arabic, Arabic was not writing, it was an image. It was a symbol, one valued much in the way we might buy a perfume with Paris written on it today. And for the Vikings, 10th century Islamic cities like Baghdad or Cairo or Cordoba were the Paris of their day, glittering capitals of art, scientific knowledge, and culture. And in addition to the ring, we have further evidence of the use of Arabic as social capital in the form of pseudo-Kufic or imitation Kufic inscriptions on weights for measuring silver, underscoring that it didn't matter if the object actually said something, it just mattered that it bore the marks of a script associated with wealth and refinement, further instantiating the idea of text working as image. But there are also examples of the use of real Kufic, most famously in the case of the dirham of the Anglo-Saxon king Offa of Mercia, ruling in the 8th century, who kept the Arabic shahada, or profession of faith, intact as he inserted his own name in the middle. King Offa's coin was modeled off of a coin of the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur, struck just 3 years earlier in Baghdad in the year 754-755. Returning to our textile, medieval Spanish ribbons were also cited by Larson as inspiration for her claims, but that also doesn't seem to work date-wise. Medieval Spanish textile expert Maria J. Feliciano confirmed to me that all known square Kufic tablet weave textiles are post-13th century. We can find examples from Santa Maria la Real de Huelgas in Burgos, or in the maniples with square Kufic-like decoration on the chasuble of St. Edmund, Provence. Both date to the 13th century. Again, too late to be an influence on the Viking textile. Interestingly, these later European examples of supposed square Kufic actually also bear pseudo-Kufic, not real Arabic writing. But obviously, neither of these 13th century textiles can be inspiration for the 10th century Birka fragment. The final argument I made in my thread was that the textile cannot have extended beyond the original band in the form represented in Larson's reconstruction drawing, which rendered the band at twice its actual width. This is because the textile is known to have had a finished edge or selvage along both sides, much as a silk ribbon does. That analysis was put forward in a blog post by Viking textile specialist Carolyn Priest-Dorman a few days after the press announcement by Uppsala University. Since the original press release, Larsson has clarified that she did not mean to say the band was originally wider, but rather that she was recombining different elements of the band found along its length. In Larsson's reading, the viewer would have presumably mentally cut up and turned and recombined two separate geometric elements to create reverse mirror image square Kufic-like letter forms, which, because they were backward, would then have to be read in reverse, as you can see in Larsson's literal mirror image. The scripts on the ribbon are like secret images, she has said. Secret messages, excuse me, she has said. This too seems a highly problematic reading of the textile, requiring a level of mental and visual gymnastics with no known precedents in Islamic art. To be sure, Islamic calligraphy was playful and sometimes employed mirror writing, but again, typically not until much later, almost really until we get into the Ottoman period, and never in a form utilizing incomplete letter forms requiring imaginary joining back together by the viewer. So one might ask why all this matters. Why should we care about whether a 10th century textile says Allah or not? Particularly in the context of the abundance of evidence for genuine interaction between Viking Scandinavia and Islamic lands, it's a good question to ask. For me, three things stand out. And they bring us back to the claim I made at the beginning of this presentation, namely that Warburg, like us, lived in a time not unlike our own, marked by fracture and uncertainty, at a moment when it became vital to make an argument for the necessity of the humanistic disciplines and for truer, richer understandings of the pre-modern past. First, this story likely went viral because of recent events. The march by tiki torch wielding white supremacists in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2016 revealed to all what had long been known among medievalists, namely that white supremacists use medieval imagery and symbolism to further their cause. At Charlottesville, where tragically Heather Heyer was killed when a white supremacist rammed his car into a crowd of counter-protesters, we saw medieval banners and chants with crusader phrases like Deus vult, God wills it. White supremacists use medieval imagery for a simple reason, because they believe that the medieval era was a time when Europe was white. If Warburg's intervention in art history was to point to Nachleben, the persistent return of images and ideas, and thus make clear how pagan antiquity had returned to animate Christian culture in the Renaissance, we might also consider how striking it is that medieval imagery has returned to animate 21st century white nationalism. But as I noted previously, Warburg also contested the 19th and early 20th century historicism and nationalism of his contemporaries by tracking the promiscuous migration of images across time and space, linking disparate ideas, images, and cultural memories in ways that often ran counter to simplistic narratives of national unity. Larsson's story about the Viking textile struck a chord with the media and the public for similar reasons, because it drew on accurate scholarship that shows the Viking era was diverse and included contacts with the Islamic world and beyond. At Birka, for example, and earlier at nearby Helge, Viking grave goods included the Viking grave goods included a Buddha from India and a Coptic ladle from North Africa. And at Birka, in the same boat grave as the Viking Allah textile, there were Arabic coins from Baghdad. As Yale professor of Viking history Anders Winroth reminds us, and as the research of Dr. Caitlin Green at Cambridge and the Dirhams for Slaves project at Oxford has shown, Tens of thousands of Arabic coins have been found in Viking lands. In fact, they're so abundant that one could reasonably argue that the Shahada, the Islamic profession of faith, is the most common inscription in Viking Scandinavia. Objects like these Buddhist statues and Christian religious paraphernalia can be described as manipulated objects, a term coined by my former MA student here at UT Austin, Elizabeth Tuggle. Manipulated objects are objects removed from their original context of origin and intentionally transferred to a new context, not because their new owners wish to use them for their original purposes. After all, there are not likely to have been many Buddhists in Viking Scandinavia, but because they fulfill a role that satisfies another set of needs in their new context. In their new context, their original meaning is manipulated, is transformed, is mediated. Warburg also understood art as a mediation. He named this quality a Zwischenraum, a mediation between what we might name the real of our physical and perceptual experience and the symbolic. For Vikings, Arabic coins and exotic objects from faraway lands undoubtedly had a multiplicity of meanings that have probably largely been lost to us. But their ubiquity indicates their status as Bilderfahrzeuge, as image vehicles, in this case, as carriers of ideas about cosmopolitanism, wealth, and sophistication. We know that such transferences occurred in the medieval Viking world, not only because of the evidence of the objects, but because we also have textual accounts. The medieval Islamic courtier Ibn Fadlan famously traveled from Baghdad to Viking lands in the 10th century, a journey popularized by Michael Crichton in his novel Eaters of the Dead. And the medieval traveler left detailed accounts of Viking customs. Many of you may recognize Ibn Fadlan's account as an artifact of popular culture, since Crichton's novel was made into a film, The 13th Warrior, which has a devoted cult following. And I should say that I paid dearly on Twitter for calling the film terrible in my thread. I like this film a lot, actually, even though it's got few issues here and there. So it seems likely that even on the popular level, a certain measure of understanding about the interconnected nature of the medieval world holds sway, enough so that news of a Viking textile with Arabic writing would fit into prior understanding of popular knowledge. But perhaps more significant, many on the left politically, a camp which incidentally I happen to include myself, in the aftermath of Brexit and the election of Trump, want to see glimpses of our genuinely diverse, interconnected European past. We want the past and its objects to represent an idealized version of our present. So the Viking Allah textile story exhibited what the comedian Stephen Colbert once called truthiness. In other words, it feels like it ought to be right because it confirms previously held memories, wishes, hopes, or biases, but in this case, doesn't seem to stand the test of evidence. Some might argue that to dismiss any evidence for the interaction between Vikings and Muslims plays into the hands of white supremacists. And indeed, after I wrote my thread, a handful of right-wing media stories appeared, most of which, predictably, distorted my overall message about connection between the Islamic world and the Vikings. But if we accept one manipulation of the facts and suppress accurate information, we are no different than white supremacists for whom manipulation of the facts is their stock in trade. And beyond right-wing agendas, there is something very troubling about what the Viking Allah story, both its rise and its equally rapid fall, reveals about the relationship between news media and experts, who, in the absence of a peer-reviewed paper by Larson, should have been consulted for verification of Larson's findings. Journalists do difficult, admirable, and vital work, particularly in the face of the changing media landscape of the last decade that has brought serious cuts to newsrooms. But truthiness cannot be enough for news media. especially in this age of accusations of fake news. When the medieval period, and particularly the Viking era, is used as an ideological weapon by white supremacists, and when other groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda use similar false narratives about the medieval past to justify the deaths of thousands, it does matter that we get this right. The media can report on the diversity of the global Middle Ages without trumped up scholarship, but scholars need the media to seek them out, consult experts, and get the facts right. In other words, at the end of the day, the Viking Allah story tells us more about ourselves and our current moment than it does about either Vikings or Allah. What then does this story have to tell us about the future of the image and about the future of the field of medieval studies? If the internet can be said to be one great living Mnemosyne atlas with images speaking directly to one another, as in the Viking Allah story, the image has truly come to define the age we live in. And yet so few of us seem prepared to interpret, analyze, and consider the effects images have. Warburg viewed history as a vital, energetic tradition, communicating through images as well as words. Warburg was alive to the way that images spoke directly to each other and to our basic emotions, activating memories deeply rooted in culture and the human psyche. Nourished on the work of Nietzsche and Burckhardt, Warburg fashioned a critical iconology to reveal not the rational progress of history, but the irrationality of the movement of images in Western culture, marking us as deeply vulnerable to claims that exemplify truthiness. We, of course, live in a time in which images can be altered at will, and are quickly entering a time in which videos can be falsified and manipulated. Indeed, Larsson's claim is a perfect example of a manipulated image, a reconstruction drawing that reproduced not something real, but something wished for, a kind of collective projected memory, a dreamlike longing for diversity and interconnectedness that is one response of our troubled present reality of border walls, fractured and shifting identities, and uncertainty. Yet in conjunction with our admirable desire to envision this diverse European past, the Viking Allah manipulated image became a powerful, irrational force that animated a global media story. It seems impossible to view the rise of the Viking Allah story outside of the context of the influx of refugees and rising anti-immigrant sentiment in both Europe and the United States, just as it would be impossible to view Warburg's work outside the context of rising anti-Semitism between the two world wars. It is striking that Warburg's response was to argue strongly in favor of humanism and to found a library and a university, though it was a humanism quite different from that of his colleagues. Warburg departed from many of his 19th century contemporaries who conceived of history as progressive and the Renaissance as a moment of profound cultural unity within that progressive movement, by instead viewing both the Middle Ages and the Renaissance as a period of transition and uncertainty, as a time not unlike his own. Warburg's conception of time, not linear, developmental, and historicist, but circuitous, cyclical, and repetitive, meant that for him, histories of art had to consider the things that resurface and reanimate the Nachleben, the survival or persistence of images and ideas. The internet, of course, has changed the medium, but has not changed what has survived and persisted. Who among us in the early days of the internet in the 1990s, with its promises of the digital utopianism of a globally interconnected world of ideas, could have envisioned the internet would instead produce a retreat from liberal values, that a world of digital connectivity would instead rouse an intense parochialism, the Nachleben or persistence of many of the 20th century's most virulent images and most polarizing philosophies, a further ghettoization of individuals and ideas into the tribalistic thinking that animates white supremacists and other terror groups, all of whom, it should be noted, are savvy users of visual symbols and of digital media. And yet, despite the evidence of the frequent impoverishment of digital resources and their alarming tendency to promote the worst aspects of Nachleben, they can also be powerful tools for change, but only if we attend to reading them through their own eyes. Recent work in medieval studies that addresses the histories of race in Europe have begun to point the way forward. Notably, Geraldine Haing's The Invention of Race in the European Middle Ages, which builds on a decade of work by scholars in medieval studies that have sought to bring the intellectual apparatus of critical race theory to medieval studies, has made a powerful new argument, namely, that European racialized thinking was not an outcome of the 19th century scientific race theory, but that modern physiognomic racial theory had older roots in medieval notions of what Haing and other scholars now term religious race. Haing's book is a landmark in the field of medieval studies and has significantly broadened our understanding of the deep roots of the construction of racial categories in European thought. But it is, as is the case with many trailblazing works, also imperfect in ways that point to some of the perils of approaching the construction of race in the Middle Ages without a deep interrogation of the colonial underpinnings of fields like history, literary studies, and art history. In a recent 45-page review, you heard that right, review essay, Sarah Pearce argues that by privileging Christian and English sources and language over that of Jewish and Muslim sources, the invention of race results in a work that also privileges English Jewry, as though it were universal for the experience of Jews everywhere, that adopted the language and the worldview of Christian onlookers to describe the experiences of Jews and Muslims, and that ultimately, quote, is more illustrative of the limited possibility of studying a truly global Middle Ages rather than just looking at it for feet firmly planted in England, end quote. Pearce argues strongly for the need to decolonize not only the subject of our inquiry, but the actual disciplinary models and approaches themselves that have their origins in an ostensibly secularized version of Christian European thought. Much like anthropologist Talal Asad, and more recently, Wendy Mariam Carroll Shaw's book, What is Islamic Art? Between Religion and Perception, both of which have demonstrated that ideas ranging from the progressivist unfolding of time to historicism itself, the ostensible underpinnings of our secular worldview, are derived from Christian thought. The subjectivity of ourselves as researchers and our habits of thought and our methods must also be subject to interrogation if we truly want to create a decolonial medieval studies. In the case of the Viking Allah thread, its viral status and the willingness of major news outlets to correct their stories was, for me personally, a forceful affirmation of the role we still have as humanistic researchers to guide and shape the public discussion, not so much about Vikings and Muslims per se, but about the value of humanistic scholarship itself as we enter our own age of fracture and uncertainty. Eventually, the thread reached over 1 million views and was liked over 5,000 times. Nearly 3,500 people retweeted it. But what was most compelling was that the response to my thread came not only in the form of likes and retweets, but also in an outpouring of comments, messages, and direct responses of a very personal nature. People often thanked me effusively as though I had given them some sort of a gift, And the response reaffirmed my faith in scholarship, in journalism, and in people's desire to be presented with transparent evidence in the public sphere instead of clickbait. Of course, in that thread, I'm doing nothing more than what art historians and other medieval scholars do every day, making an argument based on the evidence. But the episode made clear to me that in this age of fake news, ancient aliens, and media spin, people are hungry for critical thinking, transparent methodology, and good scholarship. They just don't see it highlighted often enough in their daily lives. As I've noted a moment ago, we live in an age when people see more images in a single day than a medieval person saw in an entire lifetime. It is not then surprising that people struggle to make sense of images and are particularly vulnerable to manipulated images. In this context, Warburg's notion of time seems particularly prescient. His studied attention to Nachleben, to the ideas and the images that persist, that can serve us as an anchor in this cacophony of images and manipulated images to which we are all subjected on an hourly basis. One of these ideas that persists clearly is the idea of traditional humanistic scholarship, but one that is attentive to what Sarah Pearce has termed critical compassion, that aims to write the medieval past from the point of view of the self-perception of our subjects, using the languages, objects, and sources that were produced by them. It is remarkable, for example, to learn that millennials and Gen Z are reading and buying paper books at rates that often outstrip their elders. Here at UT Austin a few years ago, our students led the charge in the saving of our art history library, which had been threatened by administrative cuts. And the role of historical sources must be to, the role of historical fields must be to serve as a guide for these impulses. But we can only do this if we step outside of our comfort zones and our disciplinary boundaries to engage the public in what we do, to lift the veil, so to speak, on our methods and our sources. We have a chance to regain control of the image narrative, but as Warburg showed us, if we allow art history to remain isolated behind its own fences, absorbed in its abstracted history of art, it ceases to be a historical discipline at all, in the sense that it can have little to tell us about our present. In this context, what is the future of the image within these historical fields? Can it truly be removed from the tactile confines of books in a library, the accidental discoveries in the stacks? Can it become purely visual, purely virtual, circulating only in the ether of the cloud, a fleeting, flashing icon in our accelerated media world? Is the image truly only image? I would argue that we must radically re-inhabit the traditional spaces of humanistic scholarship and engage them with a newly renewed critical compassion. But we must do this in a way that takes account of the essentially Warburgian way that images incessantly circulate now outside of these contexts and engage in public digital scholarship in ways that communicate not only about images, but about the value of what we do with images. We have the power to push back against the distortions of the past that characterize our current moment and radically delimit an allegiance to a modified form of Warburg's original vision, a vision that has become increasingly the form of our times, a humanism that is not progressive and nationalistic, but eclectic, inclusive, and associative. In our own time of fracture, trauma, and deep skepticism about the humanist project, we must argue for and interpret the Nachleben, the survival or persistence of images and ideas. It is this survival, I would argue, that animates the Viking Allah story and in which we can find one possible response. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that, Stephennie. That was absolutely fascinating, a really wide-ranging and thought-provoking lecture, which is, I've got lots of questions, but it's not for me to be asking the questions right away. I'm just going to be the question wrangler. So I'm going to start off with someone who's saying they were interested in the statement that Arabic scripts were seen as social capital. And they're wondering, would this be different for other scripts, such as Latin, and if so, why? And are there clearer examples of this that are not made out of precious metals?
Clear examples of the Arabic scripture. So I don't know very much actually about how the Vikings encountered Latin script, because it's a little bit outside of my normal range of field as an Arabic scholar, and would be very curious to hear if anyone in the audience had some thoughts about that. But we do know, that the Vikings clearly valued Arabic script, and we know this because we have so many examples of it preserved. And in fact, even these kind of little silver weights that I showed you in the lecture were the creation of Vikings, right? So they're deliberately imitating, in this case, Arabic script. So yeah, I'm not quite sure if I can fully answer that question due to the limits of my own knowledge, but hopefully that gives you a little something to run with there.
No, that's good. And I think this idea of Arabic as a brand, like an LV, Louis Vuitton on a bag, because the Samanid silver was especially respected as being good silver. So that would be why you'd want to copy it. It always seems to come back to money, doesn't it? Alas, everything does. Someone was saying that to what extent do you think the Allah story had more media traction from coming only a month after the similarly controversial, though peer-reviewed and rather different article about the Viking warrior woman from Burqa? The word Burqa was on everyone's lips at the time. It must be from a medievalist to say that it was on everyone's lips, but that this image of the History Channel's Lagertha being an image that feeds truthiness, and that the Vikings sort of have to bear a lot of weight in these discussions. And they also mention the Odal rune, often used by white supremacists, even though it isn't actually a Viking Age rune, even though presented as such.
Yeah. I absolutely think, look, I really think that every medievalist should be consulting for television and film. I mean, the fact that we are not all doing that work is completely mind-boggling to me, because we learn history now through television and through film, right? And, we all know that the history that's often perpetuated in those media sometimes can be excellent, and other times can really veer very far from the truth. I think Lagertha I love Vikings, by the way, I'm a big fan, but we all know the ways in which Vikings is a really striking example, honestly. I could write a whole paper about Vikings too. And I actually teach an undergraduate class called Arabs and Vikings that looks at not only genuine interconnectedness in a global Middle Ages, but actually then juxtaposes that with media representations of those same periods. And what's very striking about Vikings is that we know so little about the Vikings, actually, compared to what we know, say, about the medieval Islamic Middle East, right? And yet the showmakers so admirably tried to kind of, do this fine-grained, you really can't call it a reconstruction, it's more of a kind of reimagination based on the limited knowledge that we have of the Viking kind of world. The world building within that show in Viking lands is very rich and very complex, even though it often falls short. But the attention to minutia, the attention to detail, to religious practices and social interactions and so on, was clearly very deeply invested. The very striking thing about Vikings, and the thing that made me throw my remote at my television when I finally got to season 5, is that when they come to the Islamic world, it is one horrific Orientalist stereotype after another, to a degree that I thought we had maybe excised from our way of thinking about the Islamic world. I mean, there's even a scene where, a medieval Islamic ruler in North Africa actually is a cannibal. I mean, these are like unthinkable sort of conceptions of how the Islamic world actually was or ever is. So, so that kind of representation of the Islamic world in Vikings is deeply problematic. And I think it just shows us the degree to which, even in shows that are, very deeply funded and have a lot of resources at their disposal, which Vikings apparently eventually did, things can go horribly wrong if you don't have serious consultation with scholars from the respective areas in question. And by the way, I really think that, you know, that medievalists should be reaching out to studios and to, you know, various kinds of, you know, to filmmakers and other people who are creating popular media for public consumption, because, you know, there's a, for example, there's a group called History Studios, and you can actually register to be a consultant for them. There are ways that we could be doing more, I think, on this front, and that it really should be seen as a form of public scholarship.
No, that's
a long-winded answer, but you hit on one of my.
Yeah, no, exactly. No, and we've got a question that sort of comes more back to the specifics of the cloth. Someone's asking, I know Tiraz cloth does have Arabic embroidered on it. Are there any examples of such cloth reaching the Vikings, or more generally, does Islamic cloth reach early medieval Scandinavia as, for example, it reaches Charlemagne?
Yeah, we do have examples, particularly of, I think, some Samanid textiles and some kind of early Persian textiles making their way to Viking lands. So yes, absolutely. Tiraz, not so much, I think. I could be wrong about that, though. I'd have to consult one of my textile specialist colleagues. There may be some examples of that as well. It would be about the right time frame.
Yeah, and it does, it sort of comes to the question of what do you think maybe was actually what that pattern is? You know, we can see what it isn't, but are there any ideas of what it might be?
Well, here I'm just relying on textile specialists like Carolyn Priest-Dorman and others who provided many examples of similar types of patterns. There's you know, they're kind of typical tablet woven geometric patterns that are abundant on Viking textiles. There's nothing especially distinctive about that particular pattern.
Yeah, I think that's really important to point that out when something's billed as being a unicum, to highlight the fact that it's one of many. So maybe not the sort of focus, but then once the narrative started, you know, it's very hard. Someone asked the question, which I will refrain from answering. I'll let you. Have there been Viking artifacts found in tombs from Muslim nations, or in the sort of Islamic context?
I do not know of any. Do you, Richard?
Well, no, the trade was silver one way and slaves the other way. So the slaves are in the ground and the fur doesn't tend to last, unfortunately.
That's essentially
trading route up the Baltic.
Yeah, I can't think of a single. I can think of other kinds of European objects that end up very far afield. So in Central Asia and things like that, and some, you know, Kurgan tomb burials, for example, of kind of, you know, nomadic warriors and things like that. But specifically Viking, I wouldn't say, no.
Someone said, do you believe historical shows intentionally misrepresent some groups for political reasons?
I think that our society is suffused with certain kinds of understandings about the past and about others, basically. And I think those reveal themselves in our popular media in all kinds of ways. So I don't think it's so much intentional as just in the air we breathe.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that is part.
And I'm definitely editorializing there, but yeah.
And another question which touches on something quite interesting is how do we deal with the idea of Islam being alien to the West when there have been Muslims in Spain for so long? It is certainly partly an element of preaching to the converted, but I think it is important, and I'll sort of fit in with another question that talks about how do we address this issue in schools, because it seems the misconception is arriving at a very early age, or we're not doing anything to allay these misconceptions. And I guess could you speak a little bit just about what we could maybe do, or what you can do as a scholar in this field to try and do it? I mean, what you've done is a huge thing, I guess, but is there other things?
Yeah. So I'm really, so I'm now I became this year president of Middle East Medievalists, and my big sort of agenda for the future of this organization, I'll be in this role for the next 3 years, is that I really want to encourage people to do more public scholarship. I think that every time that we do not, if something relevant to the medieval world appears in the media landscape, and if we're not writing an op-ed or responding on Twitter or making some kind of commentary on this, it's a missed opportunity, actually, to use to bring our expertise out of the ivory towers that we typically inhabit in the conversations among scholars and really bring it to the public, right? So that is to say, I don't think that every single scholar must take up this mantle or you're a bad person or something. I mean, you know, not everyone has an affinity for this or finds this to be engaging or interesting, but I do think that many more of us than are currently doing this could be doing this. And this kind of public engagement, I think, it's really the raison d'etre for what we do. If we're not out there kind of shaping public knowledge, sharing the knowledge, the specialized knowledge that we have with regular folks, there's really no point. I see Twitter as, you know, a massive extension of my classroom. It's a way for me to reach out to both to my colleagues with whom I have very active relationships on Twitter, but also, and to me more importantly, just to regular people who are not specialists in my field, but who are curious and interested in the past. So that's what I would say. I just think that more of that needs to be done. I mean, the idea, specifically this question that Rizwan so trenchantly asks, you know, this idea that Islam is alien to the European context is just simply a fallacy, right? But that's not the way that textbooks are written, and it's not the way we sort of tell our story, as Europeans or people of European descent like myself, right? So yeah, so that's really, I think, what we need to be doing more of. Writing textbooks for, you know, is not a bad idea right there. Yeah.
No, I think that's we're always criticized as medievalists for focusing on esoteric things and publishing in obscure journals no one reads. And then when you do it on Twitter, you get criticized for that. So I guess you can't.
It's true that you do have to have a strong spine to be on Twitter and write for the public, because of course there's always pushback. And I'm not all of us are in, you know, I'm in a privileged position as a person with tenure at an American research university. Not everyone has that status, but again, many of us do, and we're not doing this work, and I think we should be.
No, I think, and that's a really important point, that it's not something everyone has to do, but a few more of us do.
There's enough stuff to feel guilty about without throwing that on your back as well. I mean, we've got a lot going on right now, but yeah.
And someone's pointed actually that steel was going from Central Asia, but also Viking walrus ivory and Baltic amber were around the Caspian. So there is some elements of it. Well, I think we'll leave it there. I think we've covered most of the topics that came in. We could sort of keep going, but I'm aware we don't want to keep you all night. I'm just trying to see if there was another anything that I haven't sort of covered in this list. Oh yeah, someone. This is a good point to raise. So I'll ask the question, and you can answer why it is. Why does the 16th century tile panel in Safavid Isfahan have the Jewish Star of David around the Arabic writing?
Oh, that's a great question. So the Star of David, or as it's called in the Islamic world, the Seal of Solomon, is a symbol of Solomon. So it's a symbol of the Solomonic prophet and king who was kind of revered by everyone in the monotheistic faiths, Christian, Muslim, or Jewish. And so actually many Islamic buildings have the Seal of Solomon / Star of David on them. I think it was associated with kind of apotropaic properties, kind of warding off evil, protective kind of seal that was placed on spaces, kind of talismanic qualities. Solomon himself within the Islamic tradition is thought to have the ability to control the jinn. And so it may have some associations with kind of protective spaces as well through that association.
Well, I think on that note, I'd like to say thank you again so much. We can't all applaud, but I'm sure there's applause echoing around the world. And thank you very much indeed. I look forward to seeing you here in York in person one day.
Thank you all for inviting me. I really enjoyed being here, and I hope you all have a lovely day or evening, night, wherever you are.
Okay.
Thanks, Richard. Thank you, Tim and Elizabeth and Jillian. Bye, everyone.